Hi, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce today's Gemini North Talk speaker, Jubee Sohn from Seoul National University.
Recording in progress.
Jubee Sohn from Seoul National University. So actually, we were in the same research group during the graduate studies, and also shared the same advisor. So I guess it's fair to say he's my academic older brother. So even back then, he stood out as one of the most promising members of the group, and it was clear he was going to do exciting things. So after receiving his PhD from SNU, he continued his work at the CFA as a postdoc and is now a faculty member at Seoul National University, where he is also one of the youngest professors in the department. And actually, his research focuses on observational studies of extra galaxies, particularly galaxy groups and galaxy clusters. And he has been making significant contributions to the field. So he's currently visiting us in connection with observations using Sparrow prime focus spectrograph. So please join me in welcoming Jubee.
Thank you very much for the very generous introduction. It's good to see my academic history is actually really well tonight. As introduced, my name is Jubee Sohn. I'm working at Seoul National University from South Korea. Today I'll be talking about galaxy cluster studies in the era of large spectroscopic surveys. So I'd like to begin with why do we care galaxy clusters? Because when I start doing astrophysics, the main research question I had was like, what is the dark matter and what is the dark energy? And to study the dark matter and dark energy, we need something very special to investigate them. And the galaxy clusters caught my attention because galaxy clusters are known as the most massive gravitationally bounded structures in the universe, which means their presence is largely affected by the amount of dark matter and the dark energy, especially about dark matter, because galaxy clusters should contain the most amount of dark matter in their structure. So in order to study the dark matter, we want to study where they are really abundant. Galaxy clusters are also a useful cosmological tool. For example, galaxy cluster mass function kind of thing can constrain how much dark matter and dark energy should be to explain the shape of the cluster mass function. So that's one of the reasons why we want to study galaxy clusters. Another reason is related to the galaxy evolution. So in terms of galaxy evolution, environment seems to play a very important role. So only in 1980, Dressler nicely showed how the morphology composition of galaxies vary depending on the neighboring density. And also later than that, there are many, many different physical mechanisms that explains how those galaxy evolution would be different from in the dense environment. So for example, within a very dense environment of galaxies themselves can interact more frequently and they change their evolutionary path, or the galaxies fall into the cluster environment are actually interacting with the other components in the galaxy clusters, like the intracluster gas, intracluster mass, and they change their evolutionary track. So there are several mechanisms introduced to explain the different evolution of galaxies in the dense environment, but there are still many things that we want to understand about the galaxy evolution and the impact of cluster environment in the evolution of the galaxies. So with this kind of backgrounds, we want to study galaxy clusters and the galaxies they're in. And to do that, we need some ingredients for that. So first of all, we need to identify galaxy clusters to study them, of course. And then we also need to identify the galaxies that consist those structures. So to identify galaxy clusters, several methods were introduced. So the most obvious way to identify galaxy clusters are just try to find the galaxy overdensity in the image or in the redshift space. The other techniques like X-ray or Sunyaev-Geldovich effect to trace the hot intra-cluster media were also introduced to identify clusters. And once we identify clusters, we also need to distinguish the galaxies that are actually a member of the galaxy clusters, because as you already very well know, when we take the image of the clusters or the universe, we always see all the components in the line of sight structure. So when we take this kind of image of the galaxy cluster, it seems obvious that there are concentration of galaxies, but we still need to know which galaxies are actually physically at the similar space that form the galaxy clusters. So to do that, there were several methods that were used. The first idea was using color information, because the galaxies are at the similar distance, would experience similar redshift, and they probably have the similar color. That's very rough idea. But once you have the multi-band photometry, you can estimate the photometric redshift to refine the distance estimate based on just two-band color information or something. But always the best strategy to select or identify cluster members is using spectroscopic redshift. So once we have this kind of image, this is one of the most massive cluster in the local universe called Abel 2029 with the DECAM image. You can see this kind of very dense concentration of the galaxies, but all with very similar colors. So with this similar color information, it's always really hard to distinguish which galaxies are actually the member of the clusters. So once we add the spectroscopic information like this, we see this cluster with a lot more information. So here the color background density map shows the density map of all the photometric galaxies in the field. And the contour shows the number density map of the galaxies that we know that the redshifts are same as the central massive galaxies in the cluster. Then we see the very detailed structure of the cluster. And we also see there are some high density region of the galaxies that are not really associated with the cluster environment. So without having this kind of information, our study based on the photometric galaxy catalog always mislead to study about the galaxy clusters or the evolution of galaxies within the cluster environment. In this movie shows the most striking example how spectroscopic information is important in study of galaxy clusters. So here the image shows one of the cluster that is identified based on the color information. So the image is from the Subaru Hypers Prime Cam. So what people did was once they took that kind of image, they measured all the photometry of the galaxies and tried to find the strong concentration of galaxies with the similar color information. And then what they did was they count the parameter called richness. So how many potential member galaxies are there in that cluster? And then they use that richness parameter as a mass proxy. So the underlying idea is that if the cluster is more massive, they can accrete more matter and can form more galaxies. So there are the cluster with the more member galaxies might be much more massive. So what they did was here the galaxies with the similar colors are in their algorithm they think these galaxies are at the same redshift and form a single cluster. But for this cluster, we did some spectroscopic survey. Here on the right-hand side, x-axis shows the projected distance from the cluster, the central galaxy, and the y-axis shows the line of sight velocity difference with respect to the central galaxy. as we proceed, as we obtain more and more redshift information, the galaxies with the similar color, which are thought to be the member of the cluster, are actually located, like half of them are actually located like far beyond from the main body of the cluster. So this kind of information suggests that if you simply calculate the richness parameter, which is a mass proxy of the cluster, then your estimates can be corrupted by like factor of 2, right? And then, as I mentioned at the beginning, if we use that kind of richness parameter to construct the cluster mass function to constrain cosmology, then your cosmology is totally corrupted by factor of 2. So because of these, we want to have spectroscopy. But there are
Okay, quick question
yeah.
about that. I know this is it's not for the cluster cosmology argument, but if you were to take the richness, combined richness, and then use that as a proxy for mass, the aggregate mass of those two subsystems, and compare it to the aggregate dynamical mass of those two subsystems, do you see that they're roughly the same, or are they very disparate?
So it largely depends on how dense your spectroscopic survey is for the individual cluster. So for that particular system, our dynamical mass estimates is still has very large uncertainty because of the number of galaxies you see was not very high. But it becomes more problematic for the lower redshift cluster, where you can actually have more and more the spectroscopic information for the member galaxies. So there are several papers that compare the richness parameters with the X-ray mass, dynamical mass, and so on. And one of our paper was discussed how to correct the richness based on the spectroscopic information to have a better agreement with the richness and the dynamical mass estimates. Yeah. So then we want to, so because of that kind of reason, we want to have the very dense spectroscopy. So I hope you remember my brilliant student Taewon here, who gave a talk last year to talk about his redshift measuring algorithm, Snoopy. So once we have the spectroscopic data like this, we use this kind of cross-correlation tool to derive where the redshift, the best redshift is for that particular spectrum. And we also can derive the several different galaxy properties, including stellar mass, stellar velocity dispersion, star formation rate, aging, fraction kind of information. And once we get this kind of information, we construct this kind of phase space diagram to identify cluster members to isolate the cluster members from the line of sight galaxies. So Brian, this is the kind of the phase space diagram you would get for the low redshift cluster. So it looks very different from what you see in the high redshift cluster. So for that kind of purpose, one of the projects that I attended as a postdoc was the HectorMap redshift survey, which is a very dense spectroscopic survey over 55 square degree. So we start collecting this Sloan redshift survey back in 2009, and then using MMT 6.5 meter telescope, we collected a lot of redshift within this field. So after about 7 years of survey, we reveal a lot of detailed structures in the line of in this field. And after a few years, the change doesn't look visually impressive, but we add more and more redshift to refine the large scale structures, including galaxy clusters in this field. So after 10 years of survey, we collect like 100,000 redshift within that sky. So this is still one of the most densest redshift survey in the certain field. And then this field was also covered by Subaru Hypers Prime Cam imaging survey. And when we identify the galaxy overdensity within the redshift space, when we go to check their image on the HSC images, they really look like a cluster with a very massive center galaxy surrounded by many satellite galaxies. And some of the systems show very prominent strong lensing arcs as well. So then by doing so, we can secure large number of galaxy clusters to study the cluster properties and the galaxy evolution in the clusters. Not just with the HectoMap, I have participated or led several different spectroscopic surveys, including Lobux, Hex Omnibus, MARC. And today I'm going to highlight some of the results from the MARC survey, which is acronym for Massive Cluster Survey with HectoSpec. So HectoSpec is a wide field multi-object spectrograph which can obtain like a redshift or the spectra of galaxies for 250 or 300 galaxies at the same time. So the MARC survey that I led is one of the densest redshift survey using MMT HectoSpec. It includes about 10-ish massive cluster at redshift 0.06 to 0.12. So our goal was to collect the largest number of spectra within the cluster field. And then we also didn't discriminate our targets depending on their color or location. So we simply conducted the magnitude limited survey. So we collect the spectra for every single galaxies brighter than 20.5 magnitude in the R band. And then once we obtain the kind of spectroscopic data, we can construct this phase-space diagram. And then these yellow circle shows the cluster galaxies, the member galaxies of this particular cluster. And this cluster contains like 12, 15 spectroscopic members, which is the second largest spectroscopic data for a single cluster. And once you obtain that kind of dense spectroscopic survey, we can do a lot of different studies about the cluster evolution and cosmology and cluster galaxy evolution. And I'm going to highlight just two particular applications for today. And I guess some of you, I guess everyone actually knows what gravitational lensing is, so I don't need to explain a lot of details. But for the cluster people, one of the prominent technique we use is the cluster weak lensing. So weak lensing is different from strong lensing or micro lensing because we want to measure the very slight distortion of galaxy images due to when the light from the galaxy pass through the massive gravitational potential of the galaxy cluster. But as the name suggests, it's a very weak effect. So to secure the statistical meaning, we need to have a large number of galaxy distortion measurement. And this plot shows what we actually measure. So this plot shows the E1 and E2, which is the ellipticity of galaxies in the just X and Y axis on the image. So what people assume is that if the galaxies in the line of sight direction are randomly distributed, then the E1 and E2 distributions must be random within the field. But if there is a very strong gravitational potential, probably like galaxy cluster, then this gravitational potential distort the image of the galaxies and make their ellipticity, make their images a little bit elongated. But particularly with respect to the tangential direction to the line that connects the galaxy and the center of the cluster. So if there is a weak lensing signature, you see the galaxies align with the tangential direction slightly, while in the cross direction, they are randomly distributed. So that's what we want to measure. But this is there are so many difficulties to do this kind of lensing analysis. First of all, for the lensing analysis, what we measure is the ellipticities of the galaxy. But when you see the galaxy images, you know the galaxies have very diverse elongation, right? I mean, I walked down this hall and there were so many different galaxy images and they all look different. How do you know whether the ellipticity or elongation you measure from the images are actually due to the gravitational lensing or their intrinsic shape? It's really, really difficult. So that's the biggest concern, biggest problem with the gravitational weak lensing analysis. And another thing is, if there's some kind of large scale structures in the line of sight direction, then galaxies may align because of the overall the large scale structures. So if there is some kind of strong alignment of the galaxies, then it will be also very hard to separate from the actual distortion measurement. But there's another thing is the background galaxy redshift. So first of all, if we measure the weak lensing effect, then the target galaxies that we measure the shape should be in the background compared to the cluster, right? So that's one thing. And the second thing is the distortion of the images are depending on the distance ratio between observer and the lens and the target galaxies. So if you're wearing the glass, you know how it works. Like when you move your glasses, then the images look very different. Same logic applies here. But this becomes problem because to secure the images, to secure the large sample to measure the distortion of the galaxy images, what people have used is the color information or the photometric redshift information. But this plot shows what happens when you use the photometric redshift information. This is the same field, but based on the 5-band photometric redshift and based on the spec Cs. Then the galaxies in the line of sight direction, their distances are, the whole structures are smoothed out because of the large uncertainty in the photometric redshift. In that case, what happens is you're actually using a lot of galaxies that are foreground compared to the lensing cluster that also affect the lensing analysis. And because you don't know actual distance of the individual galaxies, your lensing analysis also affected by that kind of uncertainty. So among these three major difficulties, it sounds like the third one is the easiest one that you can solve, right? So that's what we wanted to tackle by this study. But when I pitched this idea for the first time, people were very skeptical because weak lensing analysis requires so large number of galaxies. So the spectroscopic data you can secure for individual cluster would be too little to do this kind of lensing analysis. But I was lucky that we have quite amount of the hectospec time, so we did it anyway. And this plot shows the result. So as I mentioned earlier, the first thing we need to check is the random distribution of the galaxies. So what this plot shows is the E1 and E2 distribution of the spectroscopically selected background galaxies. And they show very smoothed random Gaussian distribution, and this one shows the differences, which means E1 and E2 distribution of the background galaxies are purely random. So there's no specific trend in the E1 and E2. But here, what I'm showing with the yellow is the tangential ellipticity distribution. You see there's some peak of the galaxies with a large E tangential ellipticity, which means those galaxies are aligned with the tangential direction with respect to the cluster center. While the cross ellipticity showed a nice Gaussian shape, which means they are randomly distributed in the field. The bottom panel shows the difference between those two histograms, and they nicely show there is more galaxies with the tangentially elongated in the field. And the yellow line here is the model prediction. What we did was for this particular cluster RL 2029, we used the mass of the cluster and predict how much distortion you would expect when the gravitational lensing really happens because of that cluster. Then I emphasize that this is not the fit to the data. This is the model prediction, and they nicely match with the actual measurement, which means for the cluster lensing analysis, weak lensing analysis, we select the background galaxies purely based on the spectroscopic information, and then we can still detect the gravitational lensing signal. So that's one application. And another application is we can set up the different redshift beams to see how much distortion really happened to those galaxies depending on their redshift. So here, yellow circle shows the tangential ellipticity distribution as a function of redshift. What we did was simply select the galaxies with a certain redshift beams and count and calculate how much actual distortion happens. And again, this white line shows the model prediction, and they match very well, which means we can actually do this cluster weak lensing analysis purely based on spectroscopic data. And also we can get the redshift dependent information as well. So with the success of this one cluster, we apply this technique to the two other cluster, and for Apple 2065, we have a very good signal. And my student really liked, she does the more analysis for the other clusters, and this plot shows the same tangential ellipticity and cross ellipticity distribution for the stacked sample, and we see the very good signal and the tomographic signal as well. So then what does it mean? How can we use this information? So the model curve that I use to match with the observed signal has two parameter dependence. First, the amplitude of the model is depending on how massive those clusters are. So if we measure the tomographic signal, the lensing signal as a function of redshift, and find the best fit model, then it also gives the cluster mass estimates. So this is the totally independent way that you can estimate the cluster mass. So that's one cool application about this technique. Another application might be with the cosmological constraining cosmological parameters. So here, different lines shows the different cosmological the model predictions with the different cosmological parameters with some ridiculous assumptions. So these three lines in between, they show the some like a reasonable boundary of the omega m and omega lambda. And if we have tomographic signal measured with the very large sample stacked, and if we can reduce their uncertainties, then we can use this technique for constraining the cosmological parameters as well. So that's the another application of this technique. When we see this kind of error bars with the 10-ish cluster, it seems a very long shot to constrain any cosmological parameters. And we did a simulation by assuming like we have like PFS-like survey down to 24 magnitude for like 50-ish clusters. Then we can reduce the error bars by a lot. Then we can start talking about how to use that as a cosmological constraint. And this is just based on the 50 cluster assumption, but with the large spectroscopic error, we can do better with more cluster spectroscopic information. So that's one of the idea we want to explore with the PFS and the other spectroscopic, other large spectroscopic surveys. Yep.
What about second order effects? So like line of sight structure, I assume it won't be as massive as the massive cluster, but I can imagine with your spectroscopic survey, you're finding groups along the line of sight, which then would lead to added lensing signal. Do you think about feeding that back into the model?
Yeah, certainly so the line of sight structures can certainly affect the lensing signal as well. So what we did was, because we have spectroscopy, we know because we didn't select the targets based on the color or anything. We actually have all the information in the line of sight direction when the galaxies are brighter than our selection limit. Then we actually know what are the line of sight structures in the field if some of the galaxies appeared in our spectroscopic sample. Then we actually get rid of them to refine the lensing signal. We do that kind of thing, but we didn't do a lot of detailed calculation, like how much lensing effect added because of that large scale structures in the line of sight direction. Simply because currently the sample size is not enough to do that kind of calculation But in the future, we hope to calculate or model the kind of impact of the line of sight structures as well. Yeah. But for now, what I'm talking about is based on the 1500-ish background galaxies. But to secure the better statistical signal, we actually need like a 5,000 spectroscopy. That can be only reachable with the bigger survey and the stacking of the massive clusters. Yeah. Before I move on to the second part, is there any question? Okay. The second part is about the galaxy evolution. And one of the mystery I have for the last few years. And so you can tell me whether this makes sense or not. In the current lambda CDM cosmology, the dark matter forms first, and they accrete to mass, and then they form those baryonic matter can form galaxies within. Then the question is how much dark matter are there in the universe, how they distributed in the universe, and so on. But the problem is we cannot actually see the dark matter. So we always need to use baryonic matter as a proxy. So the question is, what is the best proxy to study the underlying dark matter when you have the observational data for galaxies? The simple idea is using the luminous part of the galaxies. So the underlying idea is that when the dark matter is abundant, they can create more baryonic matter. They can form bigger, brighter, massive galaxies, more massive galaxies. Sounds very reasonable, right? But when we come to the matter with this kind of high resolution, the imaging for the crowded region of the galaxies, then the problem becomes very difficult. So when you see this kind of image, let's say you are assigned to measure the luminosity of this particular galaxy. How would you separate the luminosity of this galaxy from the other galaxies in the neighborhood? It's very challenging, right? And then, so the photometry itself becomes very complicated in a crowded region. Then another idea was from the luminosity and the luminosity distribution in the different wavelength range, using our stellar evolution model, we can infer the stellar mass of the galaxies that can be more direct measurement for the underlying dark matter mass distribution and so on. So they try to measure the stellar mass distribution of the galaxies, but it's also challenging because stellar mass estimates is firstly based on the how well you can have the photometry. And once you have the photometry, you need to use the spectral energy distribution feeding, which requires a lot of assumptions on the baryonic physics, like star formation history, star formation rate, and the different feedback models. So in the cluster community, there were so many different galaxy luminosity function measurement or the stellar mass function measurement to infer the underlying dark matter distribution within the cluster environment. But because of these reasons, we thought maybe we need to find another proxy to constrain the dark matter distribution within the cluster. Then, because we were conducting the large spectroscopic survey, we thought maybe the velocity dispersion, which is a spectroscopic measure, can be a useful proxy. So when we have fiber spectrograph like the PFS or the MMT ectospec that we use, what we do is we try to find the brightest knot in the galaxy images and then try to place fiber on that knot. Then what we do is collecting the light within the certain area. In that case, when we obtain the spectra, the contamination from the nearby galaxies are relatively reduced compared to the luminosity or the stellar mass estimates. And once we have that kind of spectroscopic information, what we actually measure is the different lines from the underlying stellar population, and their width of the spectra are affected by how fast the underlying stellar populations are moving around within the galaxies. So if there's a galaxy with a low mass that makes a slow movement, relative movement of galaxies within the galaxies, then the line width would be quite small. But if there's a massive galaxies that makes their own stellar population move around with a relatively high speed, then the line will be broadened up. So if we can measure this kind of width of the lines, then we can constrain the how the stellar velocity dispersion is there for the particular galaxies. And they are related to the dynamical mass of the galaxies. And these are quite relatively quite straightforward to measure from the spectroscopy. So, and also there is a good relation with the stellar velocity dispersion and the underlying dark matter properties. So here, what I'm showing with the line is the stellar velocity dispersion and the dark matter particle velocity dispersion extracted from the numerical simulation. What this shows is that once you measure the stellar velocity dispersion, they are consistent with the dark matter velocity dispersion, which is proportional to the underlying dark matter mass. So what it means is, once you measure the stellar velocity dispersion, you can go to constrain the underlying dark matter subhalo mass. And this white point shows the similar relation we obtained from the observational data. We measure the stellar velocity dispersion by measuring the line width of the spectra, and then we also constrain the dark matter velocity dispersion based on the galaxy-galaxy lensing. Then they also show quite good consistent relation with the simulation. So both observation and the simulation suggest that once you measure the stellar velocity dispersion, you can have some information about the underlying galaxy dark matter distribution. And stellar velocity dispersion is also important to understand the detailed galaxy evolution model, such as the age and feedback model. So this plot shows the halo mass to stellar mass to halo mass relation. So what it means is when there is a more and more dark matter, they can accrete more baryoning matter, but translating that baryoning matter to the galaxy mass, the efficiency becomes lower and lower at the higher mass. That's because the feedback from the agent, the central galaxy black hole. So what it means is when the dark matter halo accretes more baryoning matter, it can form the more massive black hole at the center. And because of the activity of the central black hole, the baryoning matter stop forming stars. So those baryoning matter stop translated into the galaxy stellar components. So that idea was introduced to understand the discrepancy between luminosity or stellar mass function with the n-body simulation result. But now within the hydrodynamic simulation, they also require a lot of the feedback as well. But then I had a question. Okay, if there is a central black hole that somehow affect the entire galaxy, that must be related to the gas physics, because they emit the energy through the gas. But with the stellar movement, are they affected by the feedback from the galaxy, the agent feedback? That was the question I had. So the simple analog might be, so when I'm standing here, let's say there's an air conditioner and there's airflow. The airflow can blow some air around me, but the airflow cannot affect my movement because it's too weak, right? So if that's the case, the velocity dispersion may not be so affected by the agent feedback. So then maybe we can have a better constraint about the underlying dark matter mass rather than using stellar mass or the stellar luminosity. So based on that kind of purpose, we try to measure the velocity dispersion of the galaxies within the cluster environment and see how they distributed. But before we measure the velocity dispersion distribution of galaxies in the cluster, we start with the field galaxies. So we measure the stellar velocity dispersion of the individual galaxies, and we count the number of galaxies in each velocity dispersion beam for the field galaxies, and they look like this. And then we measure the same velocity dispersion function using the COMA cluster and Abel 2029 cluster. And this is their distribution. So what we see here is the slight excess at the high velocity dispersion end, which means in the cluster environment, there are more galaxies with a larger velocity dispersion compared to the general field environment. Which is not surprising because we already know there are more massive galaxies in the cluster. That's one of the feature of the cluster. So it's not really surprising that there are more galaxies in the cluster environment. And then we extended the velocity dispersion function measurement for the other clusters. And they showed this colored line shows their the velocity dispersion function for the other clusters as well. Here we see the excess of the high velocity dispersion galaxies in the all clusters we use. But one thing very mysterious appears here. So red line shows the velocity dispersion function of the most massive cluster in our sample. And the blue line here shows the velocity dispersion function for the least massive cluster in our sample. So what it means here is there are less number of galaxies with a high velocity dispersion in a more massive clusters compared to their counterpart in the lower mass cluster, which is not easy to understand. But what we found from this study was because these massive clusters are in the late stage of the cluster accretion, so they accrete all the massive substructures in the neighborhood, and the massive galaxies in each substructures are already merged into the central galaxies. So the number of high velocity dispersion galaxies is actually small. While the lower massive clusters, they are still in the actively accreting phase for the surrounding galaxies. And each surrounding substructures have their own high velocity dispersion galaxies, and they contribute to the excess of the velocity dispersion function, which is the count of the number of galaxies in each velocity dispersion beam. So when we work on that, it makes perfect sense. And we actually saw the location of the high velocity dispersion galaxies, and they are sitting at the center of the nearby substructures. So I presented that result at some conference, and I got a very interesting question. So, okay, if that makes sense, what happens to this velocity dispersion function evolution is it starts from the general field, and it goes up to like the blue, and then it evolves into the red line. Does it make sense? Is it really how it works? That's a very interesting question. But problem is, in observation, it's not really hard to measure that kind of evolution because we don't have that much velocity dispersion measurement for the clusters in a wider redshift range. And also, we need to identify the substructures as well. So we try to use the numerical simulation to test that idea. So here I'm showing two images, one from the observation and one from the cluster, one from the simulation. Which one does it look like the cluster from the numerical simulation? Who think this one is from numerical simulation? Okay, one. And who think this comes from the simulation? Yeah. One was wrong. This is from the numerical simulation, and this is from the observational data. And from this kind of, once we have this kind of a cluster simulated in the simulation, we can try to map the observation to measure the velocity dispersion function. And because the simulation provide the large redshift range, then we can trace how the velocity dispersion function actually evolve to test the idea I just explained. So we did use the velocity. We did measure the velocity dispersion function from the numerical simulation, illustrious TNG simulation, and this is what I got. I didn't reach that point to trace the redshift evolution because at the first step we found very mysterious thing. So here the white square and circle shows the observed velocity dispersion function. And the colored line here shows the velocity dispersion function. We measured the numerical simulation. And those are the three most massive clusters in the illustrious TNG simulation. And you see that there's a very big difference. So we tried to understand what makes this difference. The first idea was maybe the clusters in the simulation may have less number of galaxies. Maybe that's why there are lower number of galaxies in the velocity dispersion function. So this plot compares the number of galaxies in the observation, white crosses, and in the simulation, blue circles. Indeed, simulated clusters contain slightly less number of galaxies compared to what we have in the observation. But the difference is only about 10%. And here, what we talk about is about 70%. So the 10% difference is not enough to explain that discrepancy. So next step was we checked the stellar mass to velocity dispersion relation. Here, the red line shows the galaxy stellar mass to stellar velocity dispersion relation we derived from the Sohn spectroscopic survey data. And the contours shows the simulated galaxies, and the yellow square shows the median relation. You see, there's a big difference between the observation and simulation. So what this plot suggests is at the given stellar mass, the simulation predicts a much smaller, 70% smaller velocity dispersion, stellar velocity dispersion than the observation. So we tried many different things, like how we define the galaxies, how we define the member stellar particles, how we measure the velocity dispersion, and so on. But none of those different definition of the velocity dispersion can remove the 70% difference. So there is some fundamental difference between the simulation and the observation. And one of the thing we found was this stellar mass to velocity dispersion relation varies a little bit depending on the numerical simulation's resolution. So illustrious 1, TNG 100, TNG 300, they all have similar mass resolution of the simulation, while TNG 50 has much better mass resolution. And their stellar mass to velocity dispersion relation is much closer to the observed relation, which means the resolution of the simulation might be the issue that introduced the large difference in the stellar velocity dispersion. And I think this is a very interesting result because the numerical simulations are usually tuned to explain the stellar mass distribution, the observed stellar mass distribution. But when they did that, the other important parameters like another fundamental parameter like the velocity dispersion, they show very large difference, which means to me, I mean, it's not easy to take or believe all the parameters in this cosmological simulations, at least to say. And coming back to the idea whether the agent feedback really affects the stellar velocity dispersion, we did another test. So using the Eagle simulation that have different agent feedback models, we tried to measure the velocity dispersion function and tried to compare that with the observed dispersion function. So we used the 5 different models depending on their agent feedback strength. And then we derived the velocity dispersion function. So let's see the left side panel first. The green line shows the velocity dispersion function we measured from the no agent feedback model. It contains more galaxies with a high velocity dispersion, which are comparable with the observed dispersion function, while they have much smaller number of galaxies in the lower velocity dispersion. But with the agent feedback, they show very similar shape, but also show the systematic difference with the observed dispersion function. And in the Eagle simulation, what happens is because their mass resolution is similar to the illustrious TNG 100 or 300, they also show the similar deviation in the stellar mass to stellar velocity dispersion relation. So what we did was we shift all the velocity dispersion function with the amount of shift in the stellar mass to stellar velocity dispersion relation. And then we made a comparison. So if we believe the resolution was the issue that makes the lower velocity dispersion in the simulation, and we take that value, we take the face value and shift the dispersion function, then the models with the agent feedback explains better the shape of the observed velocity dispersion function. While the no agent feedback predicts too many galaxies with a high velocity dispersion, compared to the observed dispersion function. At the first glance, I was a little surprised because I expected that the agent feedback has nothing to do with the velocity dispersion, stellar velocity dispersion. But what actually happens was the agent feedback can change the entire galaxy profile. So here, what I'm showing on the left is the stellar mass to stellar velocity dispersion relation within the certain aperture. So, and the different line shows the relation we derive from the Eagle simulations with the different agent feedback models. And they seem to follow the same line, which means no matter agent feedback was implemented or not, at the given stellar mass, you get the expected stellar velocity dispersion. But the stellar velocity dispersion function look different, right? That's because at the given total mass of the galaxies, the mass confined within the certain aperture is varying. So what it means is when the agent feedback is implemented, they totally change the mass concentration of the galaxies. And that change in the mass concentration result in the difference in the velocity dispersion. So the agent feedback is not directly affected the motion of the stellar component, but they change the mass concentration, and that can change the underlying stellar velocity dispersion. That's what happened with the different agent feedback models. So these are what we have found so far about the velocity dispersion function measured from the observation and the simulation. But next step we want to do is using the velocity dispersion measurement combined with the light profile of the individual galaxies, we try to constrain the dynamical mass, which can more directly relate it to the underlying total dark matter distribution. And also we want to see the redshift evolution. Yeah.
I have a question about the simulations.
Mhm.
So Eagle, TNG, everything, they don't have a realistic feedback, no? They just inject a gigantic amount of energy via a black hole, given some description.
Yeah.
But the resolution, so there is a difference between Eagle and TNG on how you split the cells, but you still, you don't resolve the black hole.
Yeah.
And so you just comparing, like at that level, you don't have prediction power in simulations. Because what you're saying, just say, oh, I don't know how it works. I just put as much energy as I can, 10 to the 46, 10 to the whatever in one cell, and then let it expand.
Yeah.
So what's your take on that? Like physics resolve the small scale, but simulation of not. And so it's my understanding from there was a paper from Phil Hopkins that basically said feedback, in the way we implement feedback now, everything that you put in, it's just like a random number that influences the galaxy at best.
Yeah.
And then we try to tune it, but it's not really tuning. We need a lot of energy going there.
Yeah. So my introduction to the agent feedback was not super clear, but my initial idea was if the agent feedback we implemented in the simulation or we assume to interpret the observational data, how does it really work? And can the velocity dispersion function kind of measurement can provide some constraints to understand how well those models were implemented in the simulation or not? So my initial project was comparing the velocity dispersion function measured from the n-body simulation and the hydrodynamic simulation to understand if the agent feedback or any baryotic physics has something to do with the velocity dispersion function measurement. But what we found when we prepared this paper, we used the n-body document-only simulation in the TMD simulation, and they all show the systematic difference in the velocity dispersion. So we stopped asking that question because fundamentally there is something weird in the simulation, perhaps the resolution issue. But for this particular paper, we thought about that possibilities as well because TMG and Eagle they implement the agent feedback slightly differently, and maybe we just wanted to check how those different agent feedback implemented in the Eagle simulation can provide the difference in the velocity dispersion function at the base values. Okay. And our ultimate goal was, okay, with the different agent feedback models, we have this velocity dispersion function measurement in addition to the luminosity function or the stellar mass function. Then can we find the better agent feedback models that explains not just the mass function, but also the velocity dispersion function? That was our goal. And as an observer, I don't have any handles on the cosmological simulation, and that's something that we want to ask to the simulation people. But your questions are very fair. We don't know how.
You're reverting the point saying, oh, if your feedback doesn't work, there's an additional parameter you can check to tune it.
Yeah, that's
okay.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. So actually, that was almost the end of my talk. So next step we want to take is expanding this velocity dispersion function idea to the dynamical mass function idea to more constrain documented properties more directly. And also we want to check the redshift evolution using simulation and also the observation because with the DESI and other large surveys, we can have more redshift information for the higher redshift galaxies and the clusters. We want to check the redshift evolution as well. So we are now entering the large spectroscopic survey era, so the data will be available for large spectroscopic data will be available, and I try to introduce some of the applications of those large spectroscopic surveys, and I hope with that large survey data we can do a better job in measuring the galaxy explore the galaxy evolution and the cluster lensing studies. Yeah, thank you very much for your attention.
Go ahead, Brian.
I was just wondering if you repeated the same exercise with different stellar feedback models, the second half of your talk. Would you see appreciable differences? Could you actually discern differences? Is the stellar feedback too weak to show any appreciable signal?
That's limited by the observational data. So, for example, where the stellar feedback becomes dominant, the mass range of the galaxies is below 10 to the 10 solar masses in terms of stellar mass.
Yeah.
While with the current R2000 spectroscopy, the limit that we can reach is about 100 km per second. in terms of velocity dispersion. That's corresponding to 10 solar masses. So I mean, if we have a higher resolution spectrograph, then we can think about like the impact of this stellar feedback as well. But currently, we don't have any observational comparison with the current spectrograph. Yeah. Yeah.
So regarding the agent feedback, have you tracked the agent feedback depends on the cluster environment and the different environment?
Yeah, so I didn't explain very much about how we select the sample of this for this paper. So here we didn't use any cluster galaxies. That's only because the Eagle simulation we used with the different agent feedback models, the box size is only 25 megaparsec, so it doesn't contain massive cluster in it. But Eagle simulation we tested with a different box size, and the field and cluster galaxies do not show any difference in terms of velocity spread function. But we didn't check the how much agent feedback, the energy budget kind of thing directly from the different simulations. But in a cluster environment, because there are more massive galaxies can be formed, there should be more agent feedback. But
usually in the very massive clusters, there's not many agents.
active galaxies
yeah.
as well. Yeah, but probably during the formation time, they should have experienced the very intensive agent feedback. So they must be reflected on the stellar velocity spread measurement. But what we found so far, at least with the Eagle and TNG simulations, there are not much difference in the stellar mass to velocity spread relation depending on their environments. They all show some systematic difference with the observed relation.
If there is no question, there's a small question.
Yeah.
I was just interested in your weak lensing, so the signature that you saw. So what like physical parameters can you exactly get from that?
Yeah, good question. So what we did here was we simply assumed the random distribution of the cross ellipticity or the Gaussian distribution of the cross ellipticities. And then we basically simulated how much distortion would happen once there is a gravitational potential with the mass of that particular cluster. Then we can calculate the distortion in the tangential direction. And then we count the number of galaxies just to create this kind of histogram. And the model was simply the subtraction between those two, the model histograms.
So it's the mass of the cluster and distribution of galaxies?
Yes,
That you're measuring?
a number
Okay.
of galaxies as well. Yeah.
And you can only get this in like big, strong clusters, this kind of measurement, or
No, there are people who try to measure the lensing analysis, weak lensing signal with a much less massive structures like groups or for the individual galaxies as well. But cluster is useful because they are massive, so you would expect better, much higher distortions that can be easily measurable. And also the problem with the galaxies and the groups, because the size or mass of them are too small, you have to stack a lot of galaxies or groups to detect a reasonable lensing signal. Yeah.
One small question, if you don't mind sharing. What are you hoping to target with PFS tonight?
Yes. So our main goal was to test this spectrotomographic idea with the PFS. So with the hectospec 6.5 meter telescope, what we reached, what we could reach was down to 20.5 R band magnitude. And with the PFS, we want to extend our survey to the 22 magnitude. Then our expectation is increasing number of spectroscopically confirmed background galaxies from 1,500 to 3,000. Then it will reduce the a lot of error bars in the tomographic signal, and also reduce the they have a better signal for this kind of distributions. Yeah. And in addition to that, because we are visiting the same cluster multiple times, we want to do some galaxy dynamics as well by placing fibers in the different location within the galaxies from the multiple visit. Then we can use these multiple fibers as a poor man's IFU unit kind of thing. Then we can constrain some dynamical informations of the galaxies as well. So that's another goal that we have. Then we can do like a constrain the velocity dispersion profile as well for the elliptical galaxies that can be useful for constraining the dynamical mass estimates we're going to have. We want to have from the simulations. Yeah.
Okay, thanks to today's speaker. And I think Dave. I think they will have a lunch here online, right? So if you have additional questions or if you want to check it them, then please join us.
Perfect weather for the
Cameron is working on the GMOS data, and he has a problem with the reduction. And Brian and Christine are the expert.
Yeah, it's been our pain because they got the data almost a year ago, but the data reduction was very tricky as far as I understand. That's one of the reasons I brought him now with me. So please,
Working lunch.
Nice. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
everyone.